Colonialism and post-colonialism.
Excuse me.
Next,
Sir, excuse me.
Next, I'd like to invite SS.
Sir, just a minute. The YouTube will be started. Just a minute. After that, you will just inform that. Tamil?
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Start பண்ணியாச்சு.
Tamil?
Yes, ma'am. Start பண்ணியாச்சு.
Yeah, you started. Okay, sir. You can. Okay. Yes, sir. Mageshwaran, sir, you continue.
இது கூட YouTube பாரு.
Mageshwaran, sir?
Okay.
Yeah, you continue.
Okay, thank you. I would like to invite to give welcome address Mr. G. Pandian, sir, Assistant Professor, Department of English, IMMACULATE College for Women, Viriyur. Welcome, sir.
Sir, welcome. Sir, can you hear me?
Pandian, sir.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, audible.
A warm greetings to everyone present here. It is indeed a great pleasure to be amidst this May gathering. On behalf of Department of English, Immaculate College for Women, Viriyur, Kallakurichi, I proudly welcome you all for this 2 days international webinar on colonialism to post-colonialism. In the joyful occasion, we are proud to welcome our resource person, Dr. Wahaj Uniza Wadda, Prince Atam bin Abdulaziz University, Saudi Arabia. She is the princess of this webinar, who is going to advise for the next few hours on this topic. I welcome you, ma'am.
Thank
Next,
you, sir. Good morning to everyone.
I warmly and respectfully welcome Reverend Sister Dr. Fatima, Principal and Secretary, Immaculate College for Women, Viriyur, Kallakurichi, who has been the pillar behind this webinar. I welcome you, sister. I feel happy to welcome Dr. P. Rini Melina, Head of the Department of English, who has been backbone of this webinar. I extend my welcome to all the faculties, volunteers, students, participants, research scholars. Once again, I welcome you all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving welcome address for the second day international webinar, post-colonialism and post-colonialism. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Next, I would like to invite to give chief guest introduction, Dr. Assistant Professor, Department of English, accuracy image for everyone. Very good. One second, welcome, sir. Sir? Dr. Felix,
sir, wait 5 minutes, sir. Mahesh, sir.
Sorry?
Sir, actually, he is trying to connect.
Okay, you can continue, ma'am.
Yes, sir, wait. Felix, sir, is trying to connect.
Okay. Yes, just wait.
Because the time is just only 10:58, so wait few more times.
Okay, ma'am. Yes. Okay, ma'am. Okay, just here some Yeshwan. I'm going to do this person. Suraj Unisa Varda, working in the Department of English Language and Literature, Prince bin Abdulaziz University, Saudi Arabia. For the past 7 years, the prior to that she worked as a senior lecturer in India for 30 years. She has presented and published papers at various international conferences and journals in London, India, Australia, and Saudi Arabia. She is a member of various national and international organizations besides being a reviewer for international journals. Her areas of interest are psychoanalysis, classical methodology, and detective fiction. Today, Dr. Wahad Unisa Varda, Prince Saddam bin Abdulaziz University, Saudi Arabia. The topic is colonial to post-colonial literature across the continent. Okay, thank you, ma'am. Once again, I welcome.
May I begin?
Yeah, yes, ma'am, you can.
Okay, all right. All right, good morning to all of you. First, I would like to thank the management, the principal, the head of department, Rini Melina, Dr. Rini Melina, and Dr. Sangeeta Lakshman for giving me this opportunity. And though things outside in India are in such a state, I would appreciate the fact that we all still have the zeal to learn. And I sincerely hope that you will take something from this session. And by the end of the session, most of you, if you've already studied this, might have refreshed your memory, and some of you might have learned something new. So with that, let me begin. The list of former colonies of European powers is a long one. They are divided into settler, for example, Australia and Canada, and non-settler countries like India. The status of the settler countries often transcend is that which has been preceded by colonization. The second college edition of American Heritage Dictionary defines it as of relating to or being the time following the establishment of independence in a colony, with the denotative definition suggests otherwise. It is not only the period after the departure of the imperial powers that concern those in the field, but that before independence as well. The formation of a colony through various mechanisms of control and various stages in the development of anti-colonial nationalism interest many scholars in the field. By extension, sometimes temporal considerations give way to spatial ones. That is, the interest in the post-colony as a geographical space with a history prior or even external to experience of colonization, rather than in the post-colonial as a particular period. In that, the cultural productions and social formations of a colony long before colonization are used to better understand the experience of colonization. This was just a brief introduction. Dr. Sangeeta has already given the complete understanding of post-colonial yesterday, colonialism and post-colonialism. So I would start with the continents. I've chosen three countries or continents, if you wish to call them. First is my choice of Canada, and then I'll speak briefly about Africa, and then in Africa I will talk about Kenya, and then finally the Caribbean islands. I will not be talking about India because India was colonized, and we have been studying colonization for several years. We read colonial literature as well, post-colonial literature as well. So I would just like to put more emphasis on Canada, Africa, more particularly Kenya, and the Caribbean islands. Each of these countries, I would divide the structure into outline. And in the outline, I'll be talking about geographical, economical, historical outline. And then I would talk about colonization. I would talk about subjugation, emancipation of the country. This is basically what I will be doing. Sorry about that. Let me just play this. Don't tell me it's not going to respond. Okay. So as I said, I'll be talking about Africa and specifically Kenya, Canada, and Caribbean islands. Let me begin with Canada. And about Canada, as I said, I would be giving the outline. It will include the geographical, economical, and historical outline. I will talk briefly about how it was colonized, how it was subjugated, and then about the emancipation. And then finally, I will talk about some of the important literary figures, their important work. This is how I've structured it. So let me begin with Canada. Canadian writers born in the early 1860s celebrated the Canadian landscape, the emergent Canadian national identity of the recently formed Dominion, used the native Indian myths and a recognition of the French-Canadian element in the formation of Canadian identity. The main feature of their literature attempted to create a national identity on the notion of Canada as a peaceful place, slow to change vis-a-vis the US, a revolutionary society. A revolutionary society, fast to change, and secondly, Canada as a bicultural society that is a mosaic of vision, of energy, and enterprise. When I talk about Africa, I will talk about the various meanings of the with Columbus's arrival in 1492. Region was and consisted of forced migration of Africans as slaves who were denied even almost continuous resistance, whether on the level of language through the use of Creole or on the level of combat through the existence of the Maroons, characteristics of the 300 years of oppression. Let me begin with Canadian literature. Canada, the land's moods, seasons, and weathers are the chronometers by which Canadians measure their lives. There is nothing benign about the Canadian epics of civilizing. The contours are mostly about hard lives and anguish of the pioneering families. Northrop Frye said that to enter United States is a matter of crossing an ocean, but to enter Canada is a matter of being silently swallowed by an alien continent. Native people believe that divinity resides within all living creatures, and man has no superior claim to this. The Europeans could not comprehend this all-encompassing spirituality, which was a common feature of the Amerindians' religions and beliefs. Amerindians are members of the Mongolide race of people whose many tribes were original inhabitants of the Caribbean and the Americas. Before their contact with the European traders, different native groups traded among themselves. They traded in copper, iron, flint, the ivory of walrus. Similarly, the hunters in the woodlands traded furs for corn and tobacco grown by the peoples in the Great Lake regions. However, the understanding of the world of nature and environment came very handy for the European traders and settlers who used it for exploiting the natural resources for commercial purposes. It is estimated that by 1600, about 1,000 ships were engaged in commercial activities of fur, ivory, hides, and cod oil trade in Canada's northwestern coastal waters. Eventually, it was the fur trade that became the main activity of exchange of goods between Amerindians and the Europeans. The Portuguese were the first to explore the New World to expand their trade and territories. Spaniards followed them by establishing an overseas empire by conquest. The French and the English were not far behind in this race to find gold, spices, and other valuables from other parts of the world. Having established their colonies in various locations in Newfoundland, Quebec, and Montreal, both the British and the French got themselves engaged in fishery and fur trade. However, Quebec fell to the British Army at the end in the Battle of Plains in 1759, and with this also fell New France forever. At the end of the 7 Years' War between England and France, New France became a British colony in 1763. The Quebec Act, passed in 1774, extended Quebec's borders and that guaranteed the French language and Catholic religion. Thus, all the colonies and in Canada came under the control of Great Britain and were ruled by governors appointed by England. At the close of the 18th century, British America consisted of 7 political units. Tied in various ways to Great Britain, the 7 had much in common. None enjoyed political independence. The British Imperial Centre had a great control over them. Their economies, being part of the pre-industrial world, were dependent upon the empire. The dependent colonial existence gave way to a nationhood rooted in Canadian dynamism that was manifested in its achievements during the First World War. Even before the Europeans arrived in Canada, dramas were performed by the Inuits and the many Indian cultures, the Ojibwa, the Iroquois, the Plain Indians. The shamans or the mystics were gifted actors who used masks, songs, chants, and speaking known dialogues. First, English-Canadian writings are about the experience in the New World, mainly defined by Canada's local and also by its climate. Too cold in the winter and too hot in the brief summer. For the earliest writers, the Canadian experience was the experience of immigration to Canada, which began as an arduous voyage across the sea and oceans. Travel reports therefore emerged as the first genre in which the writers living in the colonies of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Upper and Lower Canada expressed their sense of loss in the new place and the dislocation from the old familiar locations. Sometimes there was an excitement about the new land. Most of their writers were Europeans who made Canada their temporary home and recorded their experiences of living in the wilderness. Another theme that dominated this period was that the wilderness and the civility of Canada. The colonial enterprise having a civilizing mission. Canadian wilderness had to be civilized by turning the bush into a garden. Natives were to be civilized through Christianity, and the wild immigrants were to be civilized so that they became members of civil society. Canada was a cold place which had to be made warm with the warmth of civility. When men went out to tame nature, women attempted to civilize their homes following the social codes set for gentle ladies back home. Mrs. Frances Brooks' The History of Emily Montague, which was written in 1769, is the first Canadian novel. In fact, it is the first North American novel and is one of the earliest imaginative responses to the reality of the Canadian wilderness. Living in a garrison produced a peculiar mentality, which Northrop Frye called garrison mentality, a mentality that dominated most of the Canadian writing till about 1960s. As earlier, Canadian writers were certain of their moral values. Right was white, wrong, black, and nothing else counted or existed. Francis Brooke wrote this novel in the epistolary form of a fiction Quebec garrison life, which provides an escape for those who have come from England to return home eventually. They follow the social codes of the aristocratic England acted out on the garrison stage, with no attempt to adjust to the life in the New World. This is composed of 228 letters. It describes in detail the manners and the custom of the Kipokois and the native Indians and the sublime scenery. These letters explore the French-English relations in Canada. The history of Emily Montague is important because it provides some of the earliest imaginative responses to Canadian landscape and the insights into the experiences of the immigrants in the New World. Confinement of a life in a garrison, surrounded by an alien landscape and a climate, makes this an interesting place. The French and the native Indians come under close scrutiny of the novelist. The roles of women, different from those in the New World, are also observed and analyzed. The novel makes a case for a new language, new metaphors, and myths to define the New World. Margaret Atwood constructs the theory of Canadian literature from this trait in her Survival, a Thematic Guide to Canadian Literature. She argues that every country has a single unifying and informing symbol at its core. If for England it is the symbol of the island, and for America it is that of the frontier, she is of the view that survival is a symbol for Canada. It holds on an unfulfilled hope, a utopia, a multifaceted and adaptable idea. For the early Canadian settler and explorer, it was bare survival in the face of hostile nature or native Indians. Similarly, it was cultural survival for the French Canadians after the English took over. With that, I've covered the part of Canada. Now I will move to Africa. I will briefly be talking about the background of Africa and why it's called the Dark Continent. I'll speak about that. I'll briefly trace the history of the African subcontinent since the prehistoric times, and I will also discuss the various meanings implied in the epithet, the Dark Continent, as applied to Africa by the European colonial powers. A brief account of colonization of the continent from the time of the arrival of the first Europeans, the Portuguese, to understand the political cultural background. A detailed history of Kenya since the prehistoric times to the situation at the point of Uhuru in December in 1963. In between are the details of the first colonization by the Arabs and the Portuguese, followed by the British. Africa, the Dark Continent. In most books of history written by Europeans, the continent of Africa is referred to as a dark continent. This expression, the Dark Continent, was most probably first used by travelers and missionaries who happened to visit the African subcontinent much before political claims on its territory were made and it was colonized by various European powers. The term dark has been used for describing the continent of Africa because, firstly, these early travelers as well as the missionaries considered as dark anything mysterious that they did not understand much about. Secondly, and more importantly, these first visitors considered Africa to be inhabited by people who were primitive, uncivilized, and savages. The color of ignorance, as we know, is black. According to these early missionaries, the Africans believed in magic and other so-called irrational rituals and customs. Once again, magic is associated with the color black, as for example, the term black magic implies. Finally, there is most obvious reason for calling Africa the Dark Continent. Its inhabitants had very dark skins. These opinions, particularly about the Africas being primitive and uncivilized, were accepted blindly by most Europeans, either for trade or for colonization. In fact, the colonial administrations built upon this myth of primitivism of the Africans by stating that Africa had no history, no culture, no past. There was a sound reason from the European point of view behind accepting such an image of Africa. The European powers used the excuse of civilizing these savages for entering Africa and for staying on for the economical and political exploitation of its people. Thus was created the myth of the white man's burden, which expression meant on the face of it that the white man had taken upon himself the onerous task of the burden of civilizing the South Africans. However, as late researchers into the history, politics, social organization, and cultural achievements of the continent have shown, Africa was neither primitive nor uncivilized before the Europeans occupied it. Like the Indian, the Chinese, the Egyptian, and the South American, ancient Africa also boasted of various centers of civilization and culture with well-organized social and political systems and significant achievements in their respective fields of fine arts, like music and dance. Based on the archaeological and anthropological evidence, our ancestor, the Australopithecus africans or man-ape, was found during the excavations of the Olduvai Gorge, which is now in Tanzania, have produced ample evidence of it being one of the oldest sites of world cultures. Discovery of primitive tools for hunting, like the hand axe, is not only East Africa, but also in the Congo Basin and Zimbabwe, shows the parallel development of this culture. The most fascinating evidence about the cultural developments in Africa has been provided by the Senegalese scholar Sheikh Antop Dion, who claims that the ancient Egyptian civilization was set up and nurtured by the Black Africans more than 10,000 years ago. The Semitic world of today is perhaps the result of crossbreeding between the two races. In the course of time, it was overrun by the Persians. Then came the Macedonians, the Romans, the Arabs, and the Turks. More recently, the French and the British occupied the territory. This prolonged colonization resulted in the snapping of the links between the Delta and the original centers of the civilization back in Africa. These centers lost touch with not only the Egyptian art, but with one another as well, surviving for some time as isolated pockets, during which period they concentrated more on social, political, and moral organization of their societies rather than on material development. In the meantime, Europe benefited from the ancient Egyptian civilizations via the Greeks and the Romans. Thus, while Africa lagged behind in technological progress, Europe marched ahead full steam. The great empires of Ghana, Mali in West Africa, Ethiopia in the east, Zimbabwe in the south, and Congo in the south are a testimony that the Africans built thousands of years ago. It therefore proves as false the opinion of the European powers that when they arrived, Africa found its people to be primitive. Africa's recent contact with Europe took place at the end of the 15th century, when the Portuguese set up some rest and recuperation stations as also military garrisons on both the west coast of the Atlantic and the east coast of the Indian Ocean, en route to the east where they were headed, led by the legendary Vasco da Gama for exploring the fabled riches of the Orient. Later, as the naval supremacy of France and Great Britain increased after the defeat of the Spanish Armada at the end of the 16th century, they too entered Africa to explore its interior for economic exploitation. By the end of the 19th century, many more European powers had entered Africa. In fact, there were military clashes among them for proclaiming supremacy over various parts of Africa. It is this that led to the holding of a European conference in Berlin in 1885 to portion out Africa among them. With this, the process of colonization of Africa was initiated. Now I will move to the next part of my presentation, which deals with Kenya. Prehistoric Kenya, the Republic of Kenya, which was the abode of the ancient Gikyu and Mumbi, is an ancient land lying in the east central coast of Africa across the equator and encompassing some of the most arid as well as the most fertile parts of Africa within its geographical bounds. Once again, like other parts of the world, the people in this region too passed through various stages of development. There were no classes in Kenyan society at that time. There were only different ethnic groups and varied political and economic organizations. Because of a lack of means of communication, they lived in isolation from each other. These inhabitants of Kenya seem to have come in contact with traders from some of the civilized countries of the time, such as Egypt, Greece, Persia, and India. In all probability, it is these traders who first introduced agriculture and rearing animals to the people of this period. The first colonization of these people and of the coastal region began with the arrival of the Arab Muslims in the 8th century, who came to propagate Islam but stayed on to trade in ivory, gold, timber, iron, and black slaves. In course of time, a number of independent city-states, mostly ruled by Arabs, came up along the coast from Mogadishu to Kilwa. Most of the Arab influence was, however, confined to the coastal areas only, and there is no evidence of a similar contact with the natives of the interior. By the middle of the 15th century, the Portuguese, who had then become a major colonial power and who were looking for controlling the sources of exotic products of the Orient for trade purposes, made their first penetration of the coast in their search for gold and spices and began to expand their slave trade. In doing so, they drove the Arab rulers from the coastal areas of Kenya, Somalia, and Tanzania, which they continued to occupy and exploit for the next 200 years. The beginning of the 19th century, however, saw more European powers, particularly the British, the German, and the French, becoming more interested in Africa in general and the East Coast in particular. The number of explorers and missionaries traveled into the interior and made contact with the Africans. Towards the end of the 19th century, European interest in the continent had reached competitive proportions. In a conference held in Berlin, which I've already spoken about, in which Britain, Germany, France, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Austro-Hungarian Empire participated. It was decided to partition Africa. Germany and Britain, however, continued to clash over the supremacy in East Africa. Eventually, it was agreed that Lake Victoria would form the boundary between the respective areas of influence. The territories lying north of the lake, Kenya and Uganda, became under British control, while the territories lying south of the lake became German dominion. The British government, however, chose not to administer these areas directly. A trading company, the Imperial British East Africa Company, was founded in 1888, the granting of a royal charter to Sir William Mackinnon, a shipping magnate. Besides Kenya and Uganda, a 10-mile strip of the east coast was obtained by the Sultan of Zanzibar on lease. The company, it was claimed, had been formed for the purpose of pushing forward the civilization of Africa. The modus operandi of this colonization in the name of civilization was once again the same as in Asia. Eventually, political control in the guise of trade. However, the company soon found out that trade, particularly in ivory, was extremely expensive on account of the high cost of transportation. It was then decided to construct a railway right from Mombasa up to Lake Victoria. During this construction, which was done with the help of labor force brought from India, the company had to bear huge financial burdens. With the completion of the railway in 1901, the idea of European settlement in the area was taken up in earnest so that the traffic derived from settlement was profitable. This, together with the transfer of the eastern province of Uganda, where most of the highlands were situated, to the East African Protectorate in 1902, further strengthened the possibility of non-African settlement. Harry Johnston, who was then the Special Commissioner for Uganda, initially proposed to develop the area as a white man's country. Reports of the fertility of the land sent out the administration of South Africa attracted a number of Europeans, and as per the available records, the first batch of the settlers, mainly from Great Britain and South Africa, arrived in 1902. These settlers occupied large chunks of fertile land for both farming and trading. Through the number of ordinances, the government reserved the highlands exclusively for white Europeans, excluding the native Africans and Indians. As the landlust of the settlers increased, other tribes were deprived of their land as well. The Maasai, the Nandis, and the Kis were too suffered through removal to far-flung areas labeled as native reserves. A series of land legislations, Land Regulations of the East Africa in 1897, Land Acquisition Act in 1896, East Africa Land Acquisition Order in 1901, and the Crown Lands Ordinance in 1902 provided the government with control of all land in Kenya and parts of Uganda for selling, granting lease, or otherwise disposing of. Land grab was not the only problem brought about by the colonial policy of European settlement. The settlers wanted a constant supply of cheap or free labor to work on these farms. And with the Africans' reluctance to work for the outsiders, the colonists, that is, the European farmers, they found it increasingly difficult to obtain cheap labor. In those cases where African settlements were part of the European acquired lands, the Africans were declared squatters with permission to cultivate a small plot of land on the farm premises to keep members of the family and a few cattle. Appalling working conditions and severe restrictions on both physical movement of the squatters and also on the number of cattle that they could keep and the kind of crops that they could cultivate were definitely oppressive. Moreover, the wages were abysmally low. They were subject to the most cruel punishments on the flimsiest of excuses. In fact, their plight in many ways was worse than that of their brethren who had been sold as slaves in America by the Arabs and the Europeans. This repression, together with prohibitive rates, which were called hut taxes, led to migration of peasants in search of a living. This led to further problems in the native reserves, from which most able-bodied males were absent, earning money as laborers for paying personal taxes. It also stripped the African villages of the most efficient labor force, leaving mainly old men, women, and children. By now, the Africans were sufficiently alarmed about the settlers' conspiracy to annex their land permanently, and they formed two associations to defend their interests. The first is the Kikuyu Association, which is also called KA, formed in 1920, with the primary aim of defending the Kikuyu land. And in 1921, a more militant association, generous help from M.A. Desai, an Indian leader and journalist. It was called the Young Kikuyu Association, or the YKA, the militant struggle by the Africans, which led to the full-scale national liberation movement and eventually the independence of Kenya in 1963. Coming to the important literary figure, Nigorgi, the Kenyan writer and academic who writes primarily in the Kikuyu language. His works include novels, plays, short stories, and essays ranging from literary and social criticism to children's literature. His short story, The Upright Revolution, or Why Humans Walk Upright, Nigorgi's literary works were concerned with major social, cultural, and political problems in Kenya, in the past and in the present. His first two novels, Weep Not Child and The River Between Us, set in the colonial period of his childhood, focused on the traumatic effects of the Mau Mau uprising on Kikuyu family life and the impact of the independent school movement on the rural Kikuyu society. His third novel, Grain of Wheat, combined the memories of the Mau Mau era with the depiction of Kenya on the eve of independence, a time of great bitterness. Nigorgi claimed for the peasants who fought the British, yet who now see all that they fought for being put on one side. In Petals of Blood, his longest and most complex novel, he described the great detail in which the exploitation of the Kenyan masses by its own established elite. Nigorgi always sympathized with the oppressed and the underprivileged in the nation. Homecoming essays on Africa and Caribbean literature, culture and politics, writers in politics, Barrel of a Pen, Resistance of Oppression in Neo-Colonial Kenya, Decolonizing the Mind, the Politics of Language in African Literature, and Moving Centers, The Struggle for Cultural Freedom are his important works. Lastly, I move to the last country of choice, which is the Caribbean Islands. The term Caribbean indicates the geographical region including all the territories associated with European powers like Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and others. The territories that were part of the British Empire came together as the West Indian Federation in 1962. The discussion will be given with reference to the historical processes which have given Caribbean islands their cultural and literary identity. The various ways in which colonization affected people's minds by the imposition of the colonizers' language and the subversion of this means of control by the slaves' use of Creole. The pan-Caribbean dimensions of the politics of language is apparent from the writings of Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Edwin Camus, Braithwaite, and Edward Glissant, and their perception of history and ideology. At the time of Columbus's discovery of Hispaniola in 1492, the Caribbean islands were inhabited by the Caribs, who were in the process of subduing the culturally less advanced tribes of Taínos, the Arcox, and the Sydneys. It is from this date till about the middle of the 16th century that the demand for African slaves had increased. Following the capture of some of the islands by the British, a sizable population of West African slaves had been brought over by them as manual labor for cultivation of sugarcane and to work in the mines. The major European powers which sought control in Caribbean were Britain, France, and Spain. The development of territories controlled by them followed almost the same pattern, leading them to become plantation colonies. However, the slave population differed significantly in these regions. In the Hispanic Caribbean islands, the slaves comprised about 50% of the total population, whereas the British and the French formed 85% to 90% of the inhabitants. It is obvious that the main motives for colonization were economic. Césaire, who was the former French Caribbean minister, in his work Discourse on Colonialism, written in 1995, lists psychological, ethnographic, sociological, and political justifications which were offered by the colonizers, and he demolishes any attempt on their part to show the innate superiority of the European system of price. The exploitation of slaves by the colonial masters did not go unchecked. Resistance took many forms, primary among them being the slave revolts, which occurred sporadically all over the Caribbean. In the 16th century, there were various revolts in various parts of the Hispanic Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Honduras, and New Spain. In the 17th century, there was a series of slave revolts. Historians have labeled them the Aiken revolts. In the British Caribbean island of Antigua, in 1655, when the British captured Jamaica from the Spaniards, some African slaves escaped to the hills. They joined others who were hunters and herdsmen and who were thoroughly familiar with the mountainous region. These were the first Maroons, groups which refused to accept slave status and resorted to guerrilla tactics to protect themselves. From 1690 to 1740, the Maroons were engaged in almost constant guerrilla warfare with the British forces. These risings did not imply that all the Africans were united in their struggle against slavery. For instance, the Maroons, who had always been free, looked down upon escaped slaves. This view included the Creoles, that is, those slaves born on the islands, descendants of those who were transported through the Middle Passage from Africa to the New World, new arrivals from Africa, derisively known as freshwater Negroes. There was also hostility between the Creole slaves and the Africans, the former accusing the latter of inciting them to rebellion. Hence, the revolts, which occurred during the 16th and 17th centuries, were made less effective due to the lack of cohesiveness. Historically, the most important insurrection that took place in the French Caribbean island of Haiti at Saint Domingo in 1791 under the leadership of Toussaint, a black man who had been a slave till the age of 45. The Saint Domingo Revolution culminated in the establishment of Haiti as the first Black Republic of the New World. Why is it important for us to know about the history and resistance of the Caribbean? This is because the leaders of these struggles, men like Toussaint, became transformed into heroes in the popular imagination. Songs were sung about these victories, poems were written about them, speaking about how he came to develop the concept of negritude. Negritude is the sea journey from Africa to the Caribbean, which represents the temporal moment when the slaves were dislocated from Africa. a word which was coined by M. Césaire, defining the qualities of the values of the Black civilization in the world. It provided a positive image of race of the Black people. It also criticized the racial approach. Césaire says that negritude is an action. Haiti is the country where Negro people stood up for the first time, affirming their determination to shape the new world, a free world. Explaining the concept of Antillican, this is the collective name which is used for the Caribbean islands, except the Bahamas, conceived of as falling into two broad groups, the Greater Antilles, that is Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico, and the Lesser Antilles, comprising of the other islands to the east and the south. Césaire says, a resistance to the politics of assimilation. The first Negro epic of the New World was written by the Haitians, people like Toussaint. The case of Haiti illustrates the importance of successful resistance. Its effect on imagination is evident in Césaire's Notebook of a Return to My Native Land, which was written in 1939, where the first occurrence of the word negritude coincides in unison to the Haitian fight for independence. At the beginning of the 19th century, the slave imports continued unabated. Between 1801 and 1807, 63,000 slaves were brought to the islands of Jamaica. Oppression was practiced with a different emphasis. It was not so much physical as institutional violence, which was the norm, particularly after Britain was forced to abolish slavery in its territories due to the growing pressure at home. Even though slavery ended in 1833 in the British colonies, all major decisions were made through the colonial offices. Money was granted to the education of former slaves. Religious and secular education was imparted in an effort to convert them into docile wage earners. The 19th century saw an intensified growth of both formal church and authentic African cults. An important rising of the century was 1865 Moreton Bay Revolution in Jamaica, incited largely by a demand for the rightful share of land of absentee owners of large estates. Violence against the peasantry took severe economic forms as well. Indentured laborers from China, India, and some European colonies were brought over to keep the wages low and the peasantry in a state of perpetual poverty. The opening decades of the 20th century were years of economic crisis. Hurricanes and droughts caused losses to the sugar industry, which was already losing out to foreign competition in the world market. In spite of high levels of unemployment, planters in Guyana, Jamaica, and Trinidad chose to bring over East Indian indentured laborers rather than pay high wages to the local people. Due to the unemployment, there was widespread migration from rural areas into the cities, the departure from the land being associated with a sense of spiritual loss. In 1904, Mary Adela Walcott, under the pseudonym of Tropica, wrote about the various aspects of plantation cultures. The slaves, the big houses run efficiently by colored servants, come housekeepers called nanas or bushers, or overseers of cane and banana plantations. Her poem, The Undertone, has for its epigraph 2 lines from Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, the still sad music of humanity, whose undertone can be caught beneath the brightness of the sudden day, is the far faint cry of wounded slaves in chains, the guilt-ridden past, and the attempts to obliterate it by dismissing it as nonsense and old nurse's tale is foregrounded in the poem, which makes no claim to British superiority in order to justify colonialism. Significantly, the slave does not use the word freedom. This indicates an internalization of the oppression which does not lift even under changed circumstances. One of the main concerns of post-1950 Caribbean poetry is to build a literary edifice not based on European models but reflective of Caribbean reality. Olive Senior's poem, Cockpit Country Dreams, who remembers her mother showing her photo albums of Black ancestors. The idea that the Caribbean is a region without a history discovered by Europe, from which discovery its history is set to begin, was perpetual the hitherto undocumented facets of Caribbean history, cultures of the tribes existing before arrival, slave rebellions during the era of colonization, existence of communities like the Maroons, and the continuance of African traditions in the Caribbean. The Caribbean became home to people from Asia who came as indentured laborers and then stayed on in trade, commerce, religion, food, dress, music, and language. The descendants of these emigrants, particularly the Indian, the Chinese, the Portuguese, Irish, and the Syrians, have influenced Caribbean culture, and they have contributed significantly to the eclectic nature of Caribbean literature and society in a major way. In Guyana and Trinidad, over half of the current population are of East Indian descent. V.S. Naipaul is perhaps the best known Indo-Caribbean writer of our times. The writers of these ethnicities have documented their ancestors and their own presence in the Caribbean. Writing in 1980s, Mahadai Das, in her poem, They Came in Ships, attempts to link the arrival of the indentured laborers or coolies with the coming of the African slaves. At the same time, she is fully aware of the very different socio-historical conditions which led to these two diasporas, to the Caribbean and that of the imaginary homelands. With that, I close. I would also like to, for the participants, I would just like to show you some of the key terms. I will not be reading them for you. I hope you can use these. And these are all the terms which I have taken from this book. This book, if you want the organizers, I can send you the link. I'll share the link with you. It's free PDF version. It contains all the key concepts, the key terms, which are connected with post-colonial studies. So I'm sure you'll find this helpful. With that, I thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your amazing presentation, deliberation about different kinds of the colonial and post-colonial literature. South African American, Canadian, Australian post-colonial literature. Thank you, ma'am. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Felix, Assistant Professor, Department of English, and I could.
So thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful presentation. And on behalf of the Immaculate College for Women and the management, Reverend Sister Principal and the Secretary, Reverend Sister Dr. A. Fatima, and on behalf of all the sisters and the faculty members of the Department of English of Immaculate College for Women, we thank you very much, ma'am, for the wonderful presentation that you have given to us. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
I also would like to thank the organizers, and above all, I would like to thank my daughter for having made the presentation. This presentation would not have been possible, the PPT, without her help. And it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. And next, I would like to invite, give a word of thanks to Dr. Rene Melena, Head of the Department of English, Immaculate College for Women, Viriyur, Kallakurichi District. One second, welcome, ma'am.
Yes, Suresh. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to thank everyone on this occasion. First, I would like to thank our principal, Reverend Sister Dr. A. Fatima, who always encouraged us to do new things with huge victory. And I extend my sincere thanks to our beloved resource person, Dr. L. Sangeeta. Thank you, ma'am, for your awesome information about colonialism. And I thank our today's resource person, Dr. Wahaj Wada. After her speech, everyone should know very clear about colonial to post-colonial literature across continents. Thank you, ma'am. And I would like to thank my dear colleague, Professor G. Pondian, sir, and Professor J. Mukeshwari, who are nuclear of this program. And I am very grateful to thank Dr. A. Felix, ICC Coordinator, ICW Viriyur. Thank you, sir. And finally, I would like to thank all the active participants for this huge successful webinar. And I thank each and everyone for their contribution and their valuable time with us. Thanks to all. And the last thing is the feedback link will be shared in the WhatsApp group and chat box. Per day, 100 certificates only generated. So wait and receive the certificates. Be patiently. Thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malina ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am. The feedback link is posted on the chat box. Receive it. Now the link is in the feedback. The feedback link is in the chat box. You can use the link to receive certificates.